Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our fireside chat reflecting on the Capitol Hill insurrection, presented by WCAPS New York. I'm very happy to be joined by Leslie Gross Davis. Leslie has a very storied career with 20 plus years of expertise in public policy, security, human rights, and systems change. With a legacy of accomplishment stretching across government, NGOs, and the private sector, her oversight and investigations work has been featured in Pratap Chatterjee's Halliburton's Army and New York Times reporter Jim Risen's account of corruption during the Iraq War, Pay Any Price. She's served in a variety of senior roles in peace and security, including Deputy Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs during the Obama administration at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and as Chief Counsel for the U.S. Senate Democratic Policy Committee for former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. Leslie has been a litigator, advocacy director, and public spokesperson. Currently, as a partner at Advantage Insights, she provides strategic counseling to movements, high net worth individuals, and organizations, and advocacy campaigns seeking to navigate crisis and maximize impact. This work reflects Leslie's insider expertise in senior level executive branch, congressional, philanthropic, political campaign, C-suite, and social impact design making. Leslie also happens to be the vice chair of our WCAPS New York chapter, and we are so happy that she made time for us today. Thank you, Leslie. Welcome.
Thank you, Kaylee. And of course, the New York with CAPS work is WCAPS is the best of all of those things.
Exactly. So Leslie, why don't we start by just going over the facts of what happened at the Capitol on January 6th?
Well, and again, actually, I think one of the things that I urge folks to do this week and next, there are hearings on the Hill, and they've done a great job of chronicling what happened. And as well, it's interesting because after the fact, you find out more and more about what happened. So, urging folks to take a look at that. But I can actually tell you what happened a bit from my perspective, how my day unfolded. Which, as a DC exile, I now live in the New York City area. And the political junkie that I am, I'd set my alarm excited to watch on C-SPAN or whatever way I could, the certification of the election results. And this is something actually, jokingly, I shared a text with some friends that was an article. I think it was like the top 10 examples of fisticuffs breaking out in parliaments or legislatures. And, just sort of jokingly saying, I hope we don't see any of this today. And it couldn't have been more prescient, unfortunately. And because we keep in touch, folks that I've worked with along the way, because I've just been lucky, really, I got to say, to work with some really amazing, wonderful people, and along the way we've all sort of had similar values and mission, and really like to see how democracy unfolds. So between my other conference calls and writing memos and whatnot, I sort of had on the screen and in my feed, watching else what was going on. And eerily, much like when I was on the Hill, when you work on the Hill, there's a variety of communication sources that you end up using. There's obviously the announcement system that you hear. And there's what you see on the news, but actually you're always following Twitter to find out in real time, what people are saying is going on. And as I'm watching the certification process unfold on TV, I'm following the online tracking, or seeing as anyone else could, the people marching towards the Capitol that was happening. And I'm seeing what is shocking me is that while seemingly, if you had a split screen, at one moment you see the networks are showing the certification, and then in real time, this unprecedented event is happening with people storming the Capitol, and it takes a moment for the two to connect. For those who are watching, outside, and as I watched those events unfold, it just was sort of a flashback, and I was feeling for, obviously, those who are trapped inside, have friends whose loved ones are Capitol police officers, and believing but not believing my eyes that something that should have never happened. And also wondering, as with much that goes on, what is my 14-year-old daughter thinking of these events as they're unfolding? Is this something that is being normalized for her and for her peers? And continue to watch the events as they unfolded, seeing areas that were very familiar to me, completely flabbergasted, as saw people walking in areas that you would have never been able to walk in without a badge. Beautiful, beautiful parts of the Capitol that are hand painted, but also knowing, when you're a staffer, you're really a mechanism or part of democracy, and seeing in real time this unfold, I was absolutely incredulous. And I did not, I think at the time, because you're so shocked, I almost wondered, is the world watching this? Because it's such a magnanimous, if that's the right word, I think that's being, but it's such a momentous occasion. So for me, again, watching, knowing that the certification is going on, at some point you see on the news, and we know, of course, they had to evacuate the House floor and the Senate floor, take former Vice President Pence to safety, others to safety. You have staffers that are now holding up in their offices and various parts of the Capitol, while this insurrection is going on, while this, the rioting is going on outside. I think maybe the most surreal event, part of it for me, was once the building was considered secure, when the certification resumed, of course, jubilant that occurred, but the manner in which some of the elected officials proceeded as if what had happened just had not happened. So in one sense, very pleased, because again, they were resuming the business of democracy. But for some, and in the days following, there, I think, was a marked lack of recognition of how fragile that moment was, how important it was to call it out as abnormal, and the importance of taking responsibility for the actions that led up to that moment. So for me, it was one of those days where, I'd be really curious to, how it unfolded for you and others, and speaking to other members of the chapter. It's going to be one of those, I remember where I was when. And for it to unfold during a pandemic, I'm curious as whether there maybe was more viewership of the certification than there otherwise would have been. But what I saw that day unfold, and particularly if you've watched the hearings, and I believe today, or I think yesterday maybe, was acting police chief Yolanda Pittman was testifying. There's a before and an after, a Washington D.C. before and after, and I saw on that day the last time I was going to see a Washington D.C. where you sort of casually could walk up the steps of the Capitol, or there was that feeling of ease. And it was a day that I knew I was going to mourn going forward.
Oh, wow. It's so sad how events like this really just change the function of our capital as a whole, and how not only staffers interact with the capital, but how everyday citizens do. Um,
Well, I mean, that's one of the things we take for granted, right? And again, you, in your moment, you're thinking, I took the accessibility of what, it's the people's house, and seeing um, the people's house desecrated. And for those of us, work in peace and security, or those of us in government service, regardless of political affiliation or background, there's a sense of pride, and to see that, um, and to see those sites desecrated, and also just to see this unbridled hatred is something that is incredibly um, disturbing, let alone people who are actually experience it, who I'm sure to this day are dealing with the lingering effects of having to deal with such traumatic events.
Absolutely. It's not something that can shake off easily by any means. It'll probably, the impact will be felt for the rest of their careers, and for everyone thereafter who comes into those positions once they're done with their time. Can you tell us more about the Department of Homeland Security decision-making process that day?
Well, sure. I'm not an acting official. And so I can't actually, I think, again, I urge folks to watch the hearings and hear what comes out. I can talk about what I was sort of shocked didn't happen, right? Now, usually when you have large events, Department of Homeland Security, they can be designated as national security events. And you think of, and if you live in DC, you notice an uptick in Capitol Hill presence when State of the Union happens, right? Because it's a big gathering. And so you need to be extra on alert because it's something that could possibly be a target. And again, I'm speaking in generalities here. When there are these large events, one of the things that you do is you make sure that you're monitoring chatter, you're having robust conversations at the state and local level. That's one of the things, the reason why Homeland Security was created, because there was this failure of information sharing, at various levels on 9/11. And the importance of information sharing and agency coordination is the basis of the Department of Homeland Security. And it gave me pause that this wasn't a national security event, and the resources immediately that would have come with it, or that you would have been prepared for ahead of time. And of course, in the days that followed, we've seen, the, public information available about, people planning to go and planning to commit acts of violence. And again, this is, publicly available information, nothing, near what I'm sure the security apparatus, had access to in real time. So I'm sort of, so in one of these events, normally it would be, okay, so this is going to happen, and we do a belt and suspenders approach, and we make sure that we're prepared. And more importantly, we make sure that there is backup. Now, the Capitol Police are in and of themselves. This is something that I wouldn't expect the Capitol Police, because of their size versus the numbers of people who showed up to storm the building. That's a mismatch. And again, not wanting to play Monday morning quarterback, or because I know there are some of the finest people I worked with who were at Homeland Security, but the failure to prepare is something that Homeland Security was precisely created for, things like that not to happen. And I think part of it reflects, and this is something that the administration coming forward, I think, is going to have to retool, and it's probably time to revisit, in the decades since its creation, is, Homeland Security is a apparatus that was created to secure the borders at the time. Because if you think of the events that led up to it and the investigation analysis, as opposed to something that we're dealing with now much more, which is an internal domestic rise in hate and violence, and it, in terms of need to be retooled to be in line with that reality. Also in line with understanding what has been unleashed and what has been, I hate to say normalized, but what has been allowed to transgress without being checked. We need to have an apparatus that can seize that, that has the information sharing, that has just the people power for it. Again, because this is something where, and it goes to the importance of having diversity in public service, diversity of opinion, insight, monitoring, because I think we really need to have a reassessment of what our domestic threats are. One that is a candid assessment, that after Charlottesville, after so many other events, an updated threat analysis that prepares us for how the landscape has changed, and a depoliticized apparatus. Is one thing I can say. DHS, it was a disaster. There wasn't a partisan disaster. There wasn't a partisan, when I was there wasn't a partisan security threat. And really making sure that it's seen and we're operating through that lens. And if that had happened, there would have been no fear, I believe, of providing the backup, monitoring the folks that ultimately committed damages during that day, and we would have been better prepared. Homeland Security doesn't act in and of itself, but a functioning Homeland Security does play that coordinating role, and can help trigger. What you have is you'll have a local entity. They'll say, hey, whether it's a state or local state government, whether it's a governor, the mayor of the District of Columbia, you say, like, we need resources for this event, and Department of Homeland Security helps mobilize and coordinate those resources. And we just didn't see that happen the way that it was created to happen. That's what should have happened. And we just did not see that. We're now just learning the reasons why we didn't see that. But it's really important to call out the events of that day as not normal.
Absolutely. It's that fear of normalizing it that's really scary. Like what you said about your daughter having that be this kind of event be a normal thing in our country just is terrifying. So this is obviously something that should have never happened. How could it have been prevented?
Again, I really think we're going to find answers to that in a 9/11 style commission, and I'm really looking forward to an independent, bipartisan, all the resources that it required, because until you have all the information, again, you're second guessing. But some of the elements that I mentioned before, better coordination. I think I heard that there's some of the intelligence is just now, like, well, after the fact, from Norfolk or from other sites, is now just filtering in to local agencies. And so you're going to really have to go back and take a look at what happened and when, to find out how it could have been prevented. And we need to have that bipartisan, just really, really strong investigation, because this is something that has to be a unifying event. By unifying, I mean we have to identify what went wrong, call it out as unacceptable, and then get to problem solving.
Absolutely. What do you think these events teach us about diversity on the Hill and within the Capitol Police Force?
Yeah. So it's interesting because I remember when this was happening, I have a like I said, various groups, and particularly during the pandemic, that I keep in touch with. And of friends from college, I'm one of the few who sort of went into, I was like, Homeland Security and politics and other things. And you have this sort of, as when you are a Black woman who's worked in national security, you have various hats that you wear, and I instantaneously felt for these Capitol police officers, and which was not something that I think others shared at the moment. And I said, because I remember whenever I would walk into the Hill, the Black Capitol police officers would obviously were wonderful to everyone, but they really made sure that they gave you a smile, a nod, because at the end of the day, we were all the very few serving. We knew the amount of dedication it took. I couldn't imagine walking anywhere without I could be standing next to a senator in a full suit, and I'd still get asked, "Hey, excuse me, can I see your badge? Do you work there?" And I know that's the experience of many staffers that look like me. And I remember thinking that that's one of those moments where you have these police officers not only doing their job, obviously, to defend the Capitol, but I think there is Officer Harry Dunn. There's a piece in the New York Times when he talks about defending the Capitol, but also just the racial epithets that were just being hurled at him while he was protecting some of the very people who were supporting, these riotous events. And of course we all saw the brave act of the police officer who shepherded folks away from the House floor. It tells you it is important to have, just with anything, a security apparatus, a police force that reflects the society that you are protecting or that you come from. And because what you'll see there, if the pictures that caught me were the cleanup pictures, where at the end of the day, all this happened. It was all Black staff who was cleaning up the shards of broken glass. When I was on the Hill, the custodial staff, when I was pregnant with my daughter, they gave me an envelope of cash on my daughter's first Christmas, because they said, we see you walking around in the Hill all the time, we know, and we're just really proud of you. And there's this tremendous pride that you have, I feel, as someone who's come from a marginalized community, traditionally marginalized community, of standing up and representing your country, and showing that it can achieve the best of its ideals because I'm here and I'm doing this. And I don't want that to dampens anyone's spirit. I can only imagine if I was a staffer on the Hill that day. I heard stories of staffers were calling, making those last calls home, and if you were a staffer of color and you particularly knew, okay, this is racial violence, and what does this mean for me, and what does this mean for my boss? It is so important that we have this diversity in service, so that when we come to our responses, it is a culturally competent and informed response that doesn't underestimate what we have, these sort of non-state actors now, and these domestic threats. It is also important to recognize the trauma that I'm sure staffers are dealing with, and Capitol police officers are dealing with now in this aftermath. I think it is a good conversation to have going forward. And I think maybe it can be one of those events where, look, if you saw these events unfold, you thought it was wrong, let's double down. This is why we need more diversity in public service, and this is why we need more folks here.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the few positive things that can be taken from this. It really shines the light on the need for diversity, even more so than has been already. Lizzie, what message do you think this sends to the rest of the world about the United States and democracy?
Well, again, I like to say I'm an optimist, but a realist. And I mentioned that day that was the question that you just posed, is a conversation again I had with my daughter, and they were having with their classmates. And um, as much sorrow, as I felt seeing the events unfold that day, um, and seeing how uh, on full display was a failure to adequately respond to, I think, one of our number one national security threats right now that has gone unchecked, which is xenophobia and racism as a national security threat. The Our failure to see how, if it can be weaponized and manipulated and used to prop up, events that threaten democracy, um, was a really was laid out on that screen, as a blind spot, uh, that uh, you could the fact that there would be so much violence, so much agitation that threatens democracy in the name of othering. That's a very disturbing message. The optimistic message that I think has been, the conversations we're now having on Capitol Hill about, this shouldn't have happened, why it should, we need to find out why it happened. The pictures of, you know, um, people protecting the Capitol, the people who have come forward from the national security community and said, this is unacceptable. This is not the way we operate. Um, and I think there is a moment where we still have this window to show the world that we take this very seriously and we can learn from our mistakes. I don't think the book is closed on the narrative, the global narrative that's come out of this, and that's the optimist in me. And so that's why I really urge folks who maybe haven't even been in the space before to come forward to lend their voices, to understand, to say, you know, we're going to learn from this event. We are going to acknowledge the threats. We're going to acknowledge what not fully addressing the events of Charlottesville and certain, strands and elements of hate has, and we won't tolerate it. And also, I think it's important, as we saw the events of the Movement for Black Lives and others reverberate globally, it to be part of a global conversation. I think that's so interesting about the younger generation. My daughter is how mindful they are of our place in a global conversation, in a global community. And that's one of the things I'm hoping that comes out of this as well, that we are rebounding and living up to our democratic ideals again, but that it's been a rocky road. It has been a rocky road.
Understatements. It almost seems like it's a rocky road. So this was obviously a racially charged attack. How do you think the January 6th events affect the people who currently work on the Hill, particularly the Black people who work on the Hill?
Yeah. Um, you know, again, my heart really goes out to them. And I hope that, I'm thinking again of officers that were, or staffers that were, either, hidden away or defending the Capitol and were assaulted with racial epithets, and defending people who seemingly did nothing to rebut those statements. It's part of the push and pull, the internal struggle that you have, where what you are doing and what you do is defending the promise of democracy and the Constitution and the government versus what can be the disappointing reality often. And I hope it is not making people second guess, even though I could not blame them serving those positions, but think, okay, now this is why my voice is needed even more. I won't be bullied. I'm going to show up. I'm going to be heartened by the people who are standing up for me and standing by me. But I'm also no longer going to shy away from these difficult conversations that I think in the past we have, because they are literally life or death situations we've seen. And I hope that staffers feel more supported in that, and their experiences are solicited and valued.
So the optimist in you, I think I'm seeing. In that same lens, what do you think this means for those aspiring to one day work on Capitol Hill? I know you just briefly touched on that, but if you wanted to go any deeper.
Well, yeah, one of the things could, while I have a love affair with public service, but that tension is also it's much harder to get into than you would think. There it is much less diverse than it should be. It is, it's really difficult to enter into, to be able to sustain. A lot of times, they're unpaid internships or long hours or recommendation. There's a feeder system, and we need to open that up more. Again, because this is the people's house, it needs to reflect the people. And I would urge folks, if they're dissatisfied, troubled, as we all should be, by the events of January 6th, well, that this is an opportunity to contribute your voice and to learn more. I think one of the other failings that this has revealed is how little we talk about or share what the inner workings are of democracy with the public. That the certification process unfolds, or there's so much about the way government works, national security works, quite frankly, that it's always puzzled me why it isn't something that is more wildly investigated, embraced by philanthropy or by a broader spectrum, political spectrum on the left and the right. And it is greatly, greatly needed. So maybe we will get more, diverse pools of people working in these positions, being interested, because you see how this directly impacts your livelihood. And you can be that voice that, speaks up, but you understand how these elements that sometimes don't reflect the communities that they impact, so desperately need representation from the communities they impact.
Absolutely. So trauma always offers an opportunity for us to learn. And you've touched on some of those opportunities already. What do you think we should be learning from these deplorable events, and where do we go from here?
Yeah. I think we should be learning again not to sit on our laurels and to reassess these government structures that we've created. Even though, like I said, Homeland Security is, it seems old, but it's the newest agency, a few decades old. To listen and retool for the present moment. That's a lesson to be learned going forward. I also think to take threats seriously. I'm sort of, and not to underestimate the power of hate is just really a sad. And I think those of us who've been on the receiving end of it, not saying, you're acutely aware of the irrationality of it. And we really need to get a better understanding of how it can be used for so many other things. And also the importance of us having a larger ecosystem in this conversation. There's not just, when we have these investigations to look back, I don't, want to just hear from the various government agencies. I'd love to hear from the watchdog NGOs who monitor. Hey, there are organizations that are looking at the intersection of, national security and human rights, or organizations that, look at speech and privacy issues. There needs to be a larger, broader conversation that doesn't just include the usual suspects, because if that was sufficient, the events of January 6th wouldn't have happened.
Absolutely. So we do have a few questions in the chat. One is, what do you think we can do on an individual level to combat the ideologies that led to this attack?
There's a sign that I have on my front door at every entrance and exit in my house, and it says, "Be the good, see the good," which is, it's your responsibility, individual responsibility to be that force for good, as well as seeing the good in others. So, first, I love that the question is being asked. There is just as bad, I always say, as acting on these instances of hate, intolerance, is saying nothing when they happen around you. I can't say that enough. There is a role for absolutely everyone to because that act of omission, when you see injustice being done and you say nothing, or you stand by or let someone else take the heat, it's difficult to do, but it's so important, and it's so needed. It's so important to bear witness. It's so important for people of privilege to use that to speak out, because because audiences will only listen to certain messengers. And so it's important to use your circle, your connection, your family, your friends, to speak up for what is right, to learn as much as possible. We all have so much to learn, myself obviously included, and to educate yourself as much as possible about the experiences of other people and how our systems impact them, whether it limits or creates more opportunity. That's an imperative. And to do what I'm not doing right now, which is listen more, because when we do that, I think it gives us a better idea of what's needed and how to act.
Yeah, I'm noticing that a lot. Asking questions and listening is can make the biggest difference in people's perception and their understanding and the level of empathy that they have. One other question we got was about the potential downsides of Nancy Pelosi's proposed riot commission. What you think any potential drawbacks could be or downsides?
Well, again, not having studied the commission itself, I probably can't speak to the particulars. I can say that I think it's really important to have an independent bipartisan commission, like the 9/11 Commission. It's important for their one to have the resources it needs. It's important for it to be accessible to the general public. And it's important for it to be, thorough. Like I said, I will say it. There has to be something where people very publicly and thoroughly say that this was not normal, this was not right. And the only way we're going to prevent it from happening again is to have a thorough airing of everything that happened. And it to be done in with I think the seriousness that it deserves and in an apolitical atmosphere. And by apolitical, I don't mean if something is done wrong, you do not call it out as wrong. I mean, again, it being done in an objective manner in a way that we've done commissions in the past. We did this with the 9/11 Commission. We've got models, we can learn, we can tweak, nothing is perfect. But without speaking to the merits of that, the particular effort, it's something that has to happen and has to happen soon.
Yeah, I think one thing that I was thinking about as you were talking with the difference between this and the 9/11 attack is a level of ownership that has to happen within our own entities of what they could have done to prevent it and what wasn't done, whereas that wasn't really apparent as much in the 9/11 attack because it was a foreign attack.
That's such a great point. That is such a great point. It's very difficult to turn the mirror on yourself, and that's what we have to do in this instance.
Yeah, it presents a whole new unique challenge in and of itself. So, Leslie, any final thoughts or reflections about this before we close?
Again, I just want to end on a hopeful note. I really, thank you for time today for WCAPS, exploring this event, and I'm really excited about the increased interest activity from people going forward. I put myself out there as a resource, and I know others do as well. And I guess I just like to circle back to the question about individual efforts. There's something that you as an individual can do in terms of educating yourself, in terms of just bearing witness, in terms of using your privilege to use it as a megaphone for the injustice that you may witnessed with others. And so I just remain hopeful. I am excited for what's to come forward because I think we're in a listening and learning mode. And we'll see what happens next.
Yeah, when such a positive note to end on, reflecting on our personal power that we have in the wake of something that felt very much out of our control. So I do have to thank you again so much, Leslie. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this conversation. If anyone is interested in learning more about our WCAPS New York chapter or becoming a member, you can visit wcaps.org and learn more about what we do here. Thank you again, Leslie, so much. Have a great day, everyone. Happy weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too.